Hey guys, Dr. Sean Miravici here, and today we're talking about cannabis and exercise. These slides are taken from a course I developed last year about clinical cannabinoids and cannabis and clinical practice, so you're getting the real deal. So before I get into the actual slides, just to summarize that, cannabis has classically been thought of as a drug, not really conducive to exercise, more of a drug that makes people lazy, takes away motivation, gives people the munchies, so maybe they're a little overweight. So let's see what the actual research is telling us. So in 1975, now we're going way back, they found that in that study it did not increase vital capacity or grip strength, so there was no improvement with cannabis, but there was no detriment, like you didn't lose grip strength. In 1986, so this was a really interesting study, and to date one of the only studies that really found a definite measure of enhancement from cannabis with regard to sport. So what they had here was 12 cyclists, and they were looking at their maximum exercise performance, and what they found that after 10 minutes after smoking a joint, the max exercise performance decreased from 16 minutes to 15 minutes, so there was like a 1 minute decrease in ability to keep up maximum exercise performance, but they found that it revealed an increase in vasodilation, so opening up of the blood vessels, and bronchodilation, so opening up of the airway, suggesting possible improved oxygenation to the tissues. So they're suggesting that potentially because cannabis is able to sort of open up the blood vessels and the airway, you could get better oxygenation to your tissues. In 2001, a study looked at cannabis decreasing anxiety, fear, depression, and tension in the British Journal of Psychiatry. So that can translate to the anxiety and fear around a sports or an athletic performance. And in 1986, this study described cannabis as an ergogenic, so meaning basically performance enhancement, as it can play a role in the extinction of fear memories, interfering with learned adversive behavior. So basically what this means is they found that in athletes who had a previous trauma related to their sport, so maybe a bad fall or a bad sports related accident, cannabis could actually help to extinguish those fear-based memories and therefore have a positive effect on their performance going ahead, so they weren't sort of impeded by that almost post-traumatic stress disorder related to their sport. In 1996 in JAMA, basically they found that cannabis could have some performance enhancing properties, that it was able to help some athletes have greater concentration. I think this might have been the study where they looked at hockey goalies and how they seem to have better sort of focus with the cannabis. In 1998, athletes used cannabis for relief of anxiety and stress and to reduce muscle spasms. So now we're seeing a little bit of potential help with spastic muscles. But again, we're seeing this common trend of cannabis being able to relieve anxiety and stress. So if you have an athlete that's really prone to anxiety and stress, you could see how cannabis can be used as a performance enhancement. In 2006, that study found that athletes used cannabis for relaxation, so a common trend again, well-being and better sleep. So this is something that's going to come up a couple more times. So they were seeing that athletes, for the most part, were using cannabis to help with not really performance on the day of an event, but to help sleep before their performance, so to help them get better sleep. It could also decrease anxiety, fear, depression, and tension. So we saw that already. Now in France in 2002, this is really interesting. So the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, found that 25% of athletes had positive tests for cannabis, and that prompted sort of a survey of over 1,000 sport university students on cannabis use. And what they found was that the relaxing properties frequently used to enhance sports performance. So basically, they were using cannabis for its relaxation properties. And what was really surprising is that they found with the higher level of competition, so athletes at a higher level of competition, there was actually more cannabis use. So maybe suggesting because they're at a higher level of competition, there's more riding on it, there's more anxiety, there's more tension and fear. So the athletes were actually using cannabis more. That's one of the studies that they looked at. Oh, this is the one where they found that there was an increase in bronchodilation, and actually I think we'll revisit this one, but they looked at sort of some of these respiratory markers. Is marijuana-induced bronchodilation, oh sorry, that's force FEV1, that's the forced expiratory volume in 1 second. And yeah, that's it. So that's one of the only sort of physiological markers that they've shown for performance enhancing with cannabis, this sort of ability to maybe enhance respiration. Okay, now getting back to that Angela Bryan epidemiological study that I talked about at the beginning. So again, to reiterate it, there's the stereotype as the lazy, mangy, junk food consuming cannabis user. So Angela Bryan wanted to see if that rings true. So basically she investigated cannabis. Does it put people at risk of lifestyle related health conditions such as obesity, eating more junk food and so on and so forth, less activity? But her study actually revealed that the opposite was true. So nationwide US studies report that compared to non-users, non-cannabis users, cannabis users had a lower prevalence of obesity. And so there's the study there, if you want to check it out. Prevalence of obesity is lower in cannabis users than in non-users. So her team surveyed more than 600 cannabis users living in US states where the drug is legal. So they asked questions about exercise habits and other health factors. And 4 out of the 5 respondents said they use cannabis immediately before or after exercise. And those who mixed cannabis and exercise spent more minutes per week exercising than those who didn't mix the two. Very interesting. Not something that she thought of going into the study. It was a surprising result. So 70% of respondents who used cannabis before working out said it made exercising more enjoyable. So one thing that cannabis has in common with like enjoyable things in general is that THC in particular stimulates this cannabinoid receptor, CB1, which is involved in sort of the dopamine reward system. So you're actually sort of getting a hit of dopamine with that THC use too. And so that could be part of the reason why it makes exercise more enjoyable for some people. So Bryan suggested the specific chemical interactions at play, and one thing they looked at was the phenomenon of the runner's high. So it was classically believed to be related to the runner's high, related to endorphin release, right? So like endorphins, epinephrine, that rush that you get when you're like in stress or you're in athlete event. But what they did was there was people who took an opioid blocking drug, so it would basically cut off the ability for them to experience that sort of epinephrine release. And before exercising, they still achieve states of bliss during the workout. So they're thinking maybe something else aside from this idea of the endorphin release is at play with this sort of blissful state known as the runner's high. So alternatively, what they hypothesized that the runner's high might actually originate in our endocannabinoid system. So, this is a whole nother vlog I might have to do, but we basically have a system in our body that's really aimed at maintaining homeostasis or balance in the body. And that's where our cannabinoids, we make our own cannabinoids called endocannabinoids. That's where they sort of interplay on that system. And that's also where cannabinoids originating from outside of our body, called phytocannabinoids, can interact with that system. So in 2003, they found that elevated levels of one of these cannabinoids we make internally, called anandamide, in the blood of volunteers after running or cycling in a lab setting. So now they're thinking maybe it's these endocannabinoids that are implicated in that runner's high. And that's the study there, if you're interested in looking at it. Okay, so aside from just sort of reward pathways and things like that, what are some of the other reasons we kind of think of cannabis being used for exercise? Well, one common one is aiding in recovery. So in Brian's survey, 70% of the users said that it did help with recovery. So what cannabis might do is modulate post-exercise inflammation. And really CBD, the cannabidiol CBD, is really what shines here with regard to inflammation. So CBD is shown to suppress pro-inflammatory cytokines. That just means chemicals that induce inflammation. And while THC is less anti-inflammatory than CBD, THC can also help to manage pain. And that's why we use it a lot in clinical practice with pain conditions. A survey of 126 people at Humboldt State University reported that cannabis increased focus, concentration, and mind-body awareness. So just some other things that some users have reported cannabis being helpful for. It was also asked if people had negative experiences after combining cannabis and exercise, and 40% reported adverse effects. So important to know that, yeah, there are some negative things. And what these adverse effects included were mostly elevated heart rate, which is a common phenomenon, particularly with THC, and being too high to continue their workout. So, you know, an obvious one there. Some of the limitations of these studies, there was no non-user control group, so there wasn't really a good control group, and the states that they polled were states that typically have a higher rate of people who are fit and healthy. So, you know, Colorado, California, Washington, they just have a more fit population in general, and they happen to be also the states where cannabis is legal. In 2018, researchers at McMaster, just down the road here, university found 3 good quality studies looking at cannabis effect on athletic performance. So they're doing kind of a meta-analysis of different studies here. They found 3 good ones. And one of the ones that they decided to include, well, one of the only ones, was that study looking at the forced expiration volume, so that bronchodilation effect. So still really to this day, that's like one of the only measurable physiological performance enhancing effects of cannabis. A lot of the other stuff that we've just talked about being potentially performance enhancing has a lot to do with the brain and psychology. This is interesting in regard to the Olympics. So 2 studies had participants exercise before and after smoking cannabis. Blah, blah, blah. Sole positive finding was increased for, okay, we talked about that. So moving on. So WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Association, I think I got that right. So they banned cannabis back in 2004, so it was a banned substance. And then and interestingly enough, just prior to that was that, if anyone remembers, that whole incident regarding that snowboarder Ross Rebliati, who was found to have traces of cannabis in his blood after winning gold. I believe it was in a snowboarding event. It wasn't a banned substance at the time, so he got his medal back. But then they quickly after made a banned substance, and then in 2013 there was an amendment that raised the THC limit from 15 nanograms per milliliter Where's my mouse? I think I lost my mouse. But you can see on the slide to 150 nanograms per milliliter. So at 150 nanograms per milliliter, you could still pretty much smoke a full joint and participate in your event and likely test under the limit. So that's kind of gives you an idea of how much that is in the bloodstream. Cannabis research still met with many obstacles. So one of the interesting obstacles is it's still legal in many states, and so there's issues around studying it on university campuses because of its legal status. And finally, just this year, a study came out looking at cannabis and exercise in rat models. So they looked at THC specifically, its effect on the preference and motivation for wheel running in mice. So it's kind of a little bit of a comparison, looking at mice and mice activity to humans, but it was interesting nonetheless. And what they found was that THC had no impact on these mice, their motivation to exercise. So they looked at a couple different factors, and it made no difference. So furthermore, showing that there's not really a negative implication of cannabis use and exercise. So that's it, guys. Cannabis and exercise in a nutshell. So just in summary, the misconception of cannabis being a lazy man's drug or associated with people who are unhealthy, unmotivated, obese is untrue. And for the most part, it seems like a lot of the positive effects of cannabis on exercise are to do with people's psychology, how it affects their thinking of past traumas like post-traumatic stress related to sports performance. It might have some impact on blood vessel dilation and respiration, bringing more nutrients to the tissue. And there is something to be said about recovery, because in particular CBD is a anti-inflammatory compound. That's cannabidiol, one of the cannabinoids in cannabis. And THC, while not anti-inflammatory, does have a pain modulating ability to it, so helping to decrease pain if there was some sort of injury or just post-exercise soreness. Okay guys, hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back soon with some more cannabis education.